All right, folks. So obviously, I sent you an email last night that kind of goes over what we're going to be doing over the next couple of weeks. So we're putting the game, the Age of Empires game, on pause for now. Maybe we'll get back to that when we get back to school. Instead, we're going to be focusing on a new unit, which I call the Early Modern Era. This covers a lot of different things that we could spend a whole semester talking about, but since we have limited time, we're going to have to cover it all in just a few weeks. So we'll go ahead and kind of take a look at the five main topics we're going to be talking about this unit. Okay, so five important periods that we're going to be covering here. First, starting with the Renaissance. When we finished the Middle Ages, I told you how the Renaissance was kind of when we, as a society, at least a Western society, achieved where things had been at the height of the Roman Empire. So after like 1,000 or more years, we'd finally gotten back to that point. So we're going to talk about the Renaissance, specifically painters and thinkers and important people from that era. We're going to talk about the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. That's going to make big changes for just religion in general, and in particular the Catholic Church that would be affected significantly by the Reformation. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about a period known as the Enlightenment. This is where education became much more of a focus, and there were great modernizations in science and education and philosophy and medicine and law and all kinds of different things. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We're going to shift gears after that and talk about the French Revolution. Interesting thing about the French Revolution is that this and this and this kind of helped lead to the French Revolution happening. Okay, and as we kind of go on through this stuff, I'm going to explain to you how kind of each of these periods is not possible without what happened in the time period prior. Like for the Renaissance, it took 1,000 years for society to modernize to the point where they were able to move forward again for the first time in forever. Okay, the Reformation doesn't happen without renewed focus on thinking and focus on the individual and things that were brought about by the Renaissance. Okay, the Enlightenment doesn't happen without the Reformation, where during this time, people felt more comfortable with sharing their own ideas and things, and weren't so beholden to the church for telling them about everything that they should think and believe and all that stuff, right? And the French Revolution was kind of the culmination of a lot of things, as was the Industrial Revolution, which we'll talk about as well. That all these Enlightenment thinkers and ideas and stuff coming through this period led to kind of renewed ability for people to make decisions on their own and think about life in a different way. And because they're able to think about life in a different way, this is where we get to have things like the Industrial Revolution. We get to have the French get to have something like the French Revolution that kind of changes the future of that country, and we'll get into that more once we get to that point. So let's go ahead and move forward, and we'll kind of get into the basic stuff here. Renaissance. Okay, so basically, you can talk about different kind of time periods when the Renaissance started. A lot of historians say sometime during the 1300s. When we think of the Renaissance, a lot of people think of artists primarily in paintings, and we'll spend a lot of time kind of looking at paintings and talking about that stuff and breaking it down a little bit. But it was also a little bit of a philosophical movement, a movement in writing and new ideas of expression in that way too, and a movement for education. So you have to consider all that when thinking about the Renaissance. But it begins, we'll say, during the 1300s, primarily in Italy, but it happens all over Europe as well, at least in the more modernized, for that time, areas of Europe. Okay, the word Renaissance itself means rebirth. Okay, and this time, during the 1300s, the 14th century into the 15th century, is a real rebirth of kind of a new way to look at society. People expressing themselves more, people having new and different experiences, people enjoying art again and literature again and learning again, really for the first time in quite a while. Okay, we talked about people like Charlemagne and other kings and leaders from the Middle Ages period and their important role in making this possible. Remember, I said Charlemagne was the person that kept alive a lot of the old Roman text, ordered monks to rewrite all that stuff and make it, preserve it for future generations. Well, as more and more people are learning and are able to read, they're discovering these stuff and these new ideas that have been gone for centuries, and this helps lead to really, again, a rebirth or a renaissance in new ideas and new forms of expression or reborn forms of expression, right? So again, the big areas of focus here, we're going to talk about the arts quite a bit and talk about education a little bit and how that changed, and the political world a little bit as well when we're talking about the Renaissance. So that's our three main focuses of the Renaissance here, and we'll kind of continue on from there. Okay. One of the big ideas of the Renaissance is this concept called humanism. Okay. Now, humanism is basically all about a focus on the people, focus on the individual. Every individual person is important. That's not a new idea per se, but it's a new idea in terms of the time period. Look, people had always gone to the church, had always focused on those aspects of life for direction and meaning and things of that nature. Okay, humanism, in its definition, what we'll call it is an intellectual movement. So write that down, intellectual movement, where your focus kind of shifts from the church, providing most direction for people to, kind of the individual and the person. The idea of humanism stresses that every individual is important and every individual plays an important role, right? Again, humanism stresses that every individual is important and every individual plays an important role in society. So again, you got to kind of make sure you understand that. And how do we get to that point? And it goes into the education, a humanities education or a humanist education focuses on three things, basically, right? The study of philosophy, the study of history, and the study of something called rhetoric, okay, which is kind of another term for what we call here speech or English or something of that nature, right? This is an era way back then where people would go, just like in Roman times, people would go just listen to people talk, okay? Kind of like you're doing right now. What I'm giving you, and normally when we're standing up in class, is kind of a form of rhetoric. I'm up there presenting an idea to you, or maybe you're doing a class presentation, which leads to discussion and things of that nature. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about rhetoric, okay? So make sure that you kind of understand that idea, and from there, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about art. Okay, so the primary artists, you probably know some of the names, some of the main artists of this period, of the Renaissance period, and we'll get into them a little bit individually, but we'll look at the Renaissance. I'm going to show you a bunch of paintings later on too, probably on the next slide or the next recording. I'm sorry, the next post. And really, the Renaissance represents this incredible period for art, where a lot of people will look to the paintings that came in the Renaissance. I'm sure you've seen a lot of them. You think of like the Mona Lisa, sculptures like David by Michelangelo. and others. Is this really great period for art in terms of detail and human history. And we're going to kind of break some of these paintings down. First, I want to go over who some of the biggest figures in this period are. And certainly not all of them. There might be some familiar names like Rembrandt and people like that, Donatello, that we're just not going to have time to really talk about. But I want to give you kind of a few of the more important artists from this period in the different countries that they came from, right, and who they were. So obviously, maybe the most famous figure from all the Renaissance is Leonardo da Vinci. Another thing I want you to understand about these painters, okay, is they were more than simply painters. Leonardo da Vinci was an inventor. He was a sculptor. He was an architect. He was a scientist. Okay, so these people are very talented in a wide variety of ways. Da Vinci being kind of the most famous one, and leader kind of in this movement early on. Another one, a painter named Albrecht Dürer. It looks like Dürer. It's actually pronounced Dürer. Dürer was a was actually from Germany, so he's a German painter, right? Da Vinci obviously is Italian. Dürer is a German painter, and again, just like many of these other folks, they're more than just painters, right? Albrecht Dürer was also a well-renowned mathematician. So again, people with a wide variety of talents and skills, and they applied this most notably in their painting, right? Another really famous one would be, of course, Michelangelo. Okay, Michelangelo, of course, famous, painted the Sistine Chapel, the sculpture of David, the Pieta in the Vatican City. So he's a great sculptor, painter. Michelangelo was also a poet. Was also a well-regarded poet in his time. So again, another example of somebody with many skills. Okay. He also was Italian. So Da Vinci and Michelangelo are Italian. Dürer is a German painter and mathematician. Another one is Van Eyck. Okay, so Van Eyck, there's several Van Eycks actually. He's comes from a Dutch family of painters, the Van Eyck family, and basically. You'll see any work by Van Eyck could be from any one of a number of members of the family. In terms of painting, probably next to the Italian masters, this is, some people would disagree with this, but probably next to the Italian master painters of the time, like, Da Vinci and Michelangelo, the Dutch produced some of the best painters of the Renaissance era. The Dutch masters, painters, people like Van Eyck during this era were extremely well regarded and had some of the best imagery and pictures of humans of people in kind of that humanist sense of any of the painters during these time periods. All right. Obviously, another Italian here, Botticelli. Another painter. Again, another person that had very vivid paintings from his time period. A lot of these guys are going to include many religious images mixed in with very humanist images, as we say. And as we look through them again, we'll talk about them a little bit more. Okay. Another one, Bellini, another Italian, important from time. He's another one that comes from a family of painters. So kind of like Van Eyck here, Bellini is another important painter from this era who comes from another family, right? And it'll begin to make sense when I start showing you some of the different paintings from these folks. Okay. Another one of the most famous and most accomplished of all painters, one of my favorite painters, was Raphael. It's also my favorite Ninja Turtle. So anyway, Raphael, pretty interesting. Obviously, if you look at the time in which he lived, he was only 37 when he passed away. But Raphael is certainly one of the most accomplished painters of the era, maybe the most well-known, certainly the most well-known Italian, next to Da Vinci and Michelangelo. He has the honor of being the youngest master painter ever to be named a master, right? And he was only 17 years old when he achieved that, right? To be named a master would be like, you know, kind of like, a basketball player winning an MVP award, or a football player winning the Heisman Trophy, or a actor winning an Oscar, or a musician winning a Grammy Award or something like that. So it was a big deal to be named a master. And Raphael, at only 17 years old, was the youngest master ever, and he was well regarded and appreciated for his skills with a paintbrush. Okay. Um, all of these guys, and then I'll stop after this. In my next post, I'll show you some paintings and we'll talk about those a little bit. All of these guys were very, very significant for their time. And most of them, probably all of them, had something that you would call a patron. Okay. And these patrons were essentially people that would pay for their living expenses and things of that nature while they would be doing these great painting undertakings and these big projects that they'd be working on. So these people would take care of them, sometimes provide them housing, certainly provide them with money and fame and things like that that they would need. So you would have these wealthy families like the De Medicis that we'll talk about later, that would, really kind of not so much hire, but take care of these famous painters so that they could produce the works that they do. So we're going to go ahead and stop there. I will post this up on YouTube for you guys, and probably tomorrow or something like that, I'll get another one out there for you. All right, folks. See you.